Okay, so it's 10 past 4, so I'm going to get started now. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping before I pass it over to Amy and Raylani, our speakers today. Welcome to the 8th annual Small Farm Sessions. These are organized by SPEC, as you know, probably with support from KPU, UBC Community Engagement, Vancouver Foundation, Patagonia in partnership with the Make Way Foundation and Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And it's great to have so many of you here today. We have 22 people, so I think we'll probably get a few more people joining us as we go through. Raylani and Amy, if you could admit people as they enter while I'm talking, that would be great. So my name is Georgia. I know some of you, but I'm pretty new to SPEC. I coordinate the SPEC Farmland and Ecosystem Services project, and I took over from Olga Landsdorp in September. And I've been working alongside Dr. Art Baumke, who's here today, and other members of the food team at SPEC. So before we go any further, I do want to let folks know that this session is being recorded and we're planning to make it available on the website after this, and I'll also send a link out to you. But if you have any concerns with that, please let me know and you can send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat. So this is the first of 3 sessions we're doing. The next session we have is Integrated Pest Management with Drew Yates. I'm imagining quite a few of you are also already signed up for that. That's on Monday from 10 to 11:30. That one is sold out already. We do have space at our final session with Cindy Prescott, who is one of my professors at UBC, professor of forest ecology, and she's going to do a session on bringing degraded soils back to life, and that's later in March on the 24th at the same time. So yeah, we hope you can join us for those other sessions, and we're also hoping to do some perhaps additional online sessions or in-person sessions through the spring and summer, so we'll keep you updated about those. And I do want to, before we move on, acknowledge that I'm greeting you as an uninvited guest from the unceded territory and homelands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people in what's now called Vancouver. And Raylani and Amy will talk a little bit about this too, but my hope is that as we talk about sustainable agriculture or sustainable soil management today, so remember and hold in our perspectives that most of the lands that are farmed in BC are unceded Indigenous lands, and that these lands are and were part of Indigenous food systems. Yeah, so through just, we will be bringing this up in the other series as we go. And I hope that we can just kind of come back and be reminded of this. So lastly, I will tell you a little bit about SPEC for those of you who aren't familiar. So SPEC is a charity that was founded in 1969. We, whoops, sorry, one second. We work to develop practical solutions for urban sustainability. SPEC is very much a volunteer-driven organization, which gives it a really wonderful feeling to be a part of. So if you have any projects you're interested in launching but feel you need support, I would encourage you to contact SPEC. We do education, research, and advocacy focused in these areas: food, energy, transportation, waste, and climate change. So there are monthly meetings of these committees, and folks are really welcome to attend and participate in whatever way they would like to. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Amy and Raylani.
Awesome, thanks, Georgia. All right, if anyone can't see this, go ahead and just throw a message in the chats, but otherwise I think I'm screen sharing. So yes, this is a soil and nutrient management workshop. Welcome everyone, thanks for being here, and thanks to SPEC for hosting both Amy and I. And just to add on a little bit to Georgia's land acknowledgement, today we are talking about soil and we're talking about issues of soil degradation, and we do want to acknowledge that these are issues that have arisen in our area post-settlement. And another good resource to find out a bit more about the land that you're on is nativeland.ca. They have an interactive map. Okay, to give you an idea of how things are going to flow today, we're going to go through some introductions, some Zoom housekeeping, give you a little bit of a background about soil health to set the stage, and then we have 2 case studies prepared based on the questions that y'all submitted, with a little bit of a break in the middle and then some time for question and answers at the end. And just so you know, the slides will all be shared with you afterwards, if that and all changes the way that you want to interact with the workshop while you're here. So my name is Raylani. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a master's student with the Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes Lab at UBC. I study climate change adaptation techniques for small-scale vegetable growers. Prior to grad school, I was working on a series of organic farms in my hometown. I'm from Whidbey Island in Washington State. And I was managing the field for a beginning farmer training program before grad school. And I would love to get back to farming after school. And some other real fun things about me is I'm a former ballerina and I love sandwiches.
Great. So I'm Amy. I'm a research assistant in the same lab as Raylani at UBC, and my current project is working on a greenhouse gas opportunity assessment for agriculture in BC. But prior to this, in my master's degree, I was focusing on nutrient management on organic vegetable farms, and specifically really kind of budgets for nitrogen and phosphorus and balancing those 2 nutrients. Prior to this, I worked on a small-scale organic farm up in Pemberton for a couple of seasons. I've done the practicum at the UC farm. I think I used to think that I was a farmer, and now I really feel like I'm a bit of a washed-up farmer turned aspiring soil scientist. I'm all right with it for now. I probably do want to put my feet back into farming at some point, but for now I'm kind of really more wearing a soil scientist hat.
Okay, so before we get started with the presentation, we just want to make sure that everyone is kind of on the same page about Zoom. So everyone is currently muted, and we'd ask that you keep yourself muted until the question and answer session at the end, just to help with the recording. Also, if you could keep your camera off during the presentation, that helps with connectivity issues, and because we have a large group, we want to make sure that everyone's internet stays stable. And then we'll be using this chat function along the way. So for those of you who haven't found this button in your black Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat function, and you can type in your name and where you're from and what farm you're affiliated with, if that applies to you. And as far as questions go, if you need clarification as we're going, feel free to throw a question in the chats. Otherwise, we'll have time for chat questions and verbal questions towards the end. We'll also be using some Zoom polls. So you should know that when you respond to these polls, your answers are anonymous, and they're just a way for us to kind of get more information sharing between all of us and the participants, and to get to know a bit about you. So I'm going to launch this first poll here, and you should see something pop up on your screen asking you kind of about your background. So go ahead and take a second to answer those questions. All right, we're about halfway there. Keep clicking away. All right, it seems like things are slowing down. I'm going to end this poll. And then you should see the results pop up. So it looks like we have a lot of farmers and gardeners in our mix, a few urban farmers. Most people are growing on less than a half acre, but then we do have some folks all the way up to more than 5 acres. And then a decent amount of experience in this group. So a couple of folks who aren't farming yet, about a quarter of the people 1 to 2 years, and then one person more than 10 years. Awesome. Okay. So you should be able to see that. Okay, let's jump in here.
Great, this is me. So I was really enjoying looking at those poll results. That is really interesting. It is quite a diverse group of people today. Lots of gardeners, also then into the farmers. Yeah, this is awesome. Lots of small scale people, which is perfect. That's kind of what we'll be talking about today. Okay, so yeah, to just give a quick introduction to our session today, I think that in the realm of farmers looking to get more information about soil management, this word of soil health or healthy soils comes up quite frequently. And to kind of break that down into a bit more of like an understandable I guess, entity or thought process. So there's really kind of these 3 pillars to it. So you can see on down on the right, we have physical properties, we have chemical properties, and then we have biological properties. Today in our case studies, we really will be focusing primarily on measurements of chemical properties as well as physical soil properties. But soil health really is starting to bring in this new component of soil biology where we want disease-free soils, and we really want to be seeing lots of different organisms and lots of them in our soils, and really having those be indicators that we have a healthy soil. But those aspects really are not necessarily second to, but I think really coming back to the basics in this presentation is what we're aiming to do. And so in my case study, I'll really be talking about some of the chemical properties. So down there on the left, the examples are really an optimal pH, looking at nutrient levels, trying not to have too much salt in our soil. And Raylani will be talking about some physical soil properties. I really like this one up at the top, good tilth. Tilth is not a measurable parameter, but I think that if you've been in farming, once you've been in farming for a while, I think that it's an observable parameter, and so I really appreciate good tilth, even though it's maybe not this, as I mentioned, a parameter that we can measure. But Raylani will be talking about some aspects of physical soil health that we can measure, and so basically all 3 of these components come together to give us a healthy soil, and that allows us to grow crops productively. So on to the next slide. So that's kind of abstract. This is like the goal that we're working towards. And then I think where we kind of get caught up oftentimes is then we have all these management practices that get talked about. So that's crop rotations, reduced tillage, using cover crops, using compost and manures, and balancing your nutrient inputs. And I'm assuming I think some of us are over here on the left, and we're the confused guy in this photo. And we want to be working towards being the guy on the right. We have zero promise to you today that you will be as aligned as this guy on the right is after today's session, because really teaching soil management is something that oftentimes is taught over the course of a season and is learned over kind of like a career in farming. But hopefully we'll have an understanding of how these management practices, such as those listed here on the signpost, how we can kind of like pick out some of those that will help us get to that goal of a healthy soil. And so depending on the issue you're dealing with, you can pick out maybe a couple practices to get started with from some of these materials we'll be sharing with you today.
Yeah, thanks for that framing, Amy. So we're going to start with this case study 1 about soil physical properties. And soil physical properties, as Amy was saying, inform both biological and chemical processes. So as farmers and soil scientists, it's one of the first things that we want to consider, and it's pretty foundational to our understanding about how to manage the soil and how the soil will behave. So when we talk about soil physics, we're referring to soil texture and soil structure. And both of these are going to affect behavior. By that, I mean the way that water moves through the soil or is retained, aeration, and nutrient holding capacity, to give a few. And then it also informs management. So how and when do we want to apply amendments? When and by what method should we irrigate? And when is it appropriate to till? And so when we talk about soil texture, we're talking about the proportion of sand, silt, and clay particles. And texture is inherited from the parent material, so what types of rocks that your soil came from and how they ended up in that location. And this is, texture refers to just the mineral component of soil. So at this point, we're not really talking about organic matter of any kind. And all soils exist on a continuum. So they're going to be a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. And so the properties that they possess also exist along a continuum. And these particles are differentiated by size. So we can see that sand is the largest, and we move down to clay as the smallest. And because they are differently sized, that gives them different behaviors. And so some examples of soil texture that you have heard, I'm sure, would be like sandy loam or silty clay. These are examples of people describing their soil texture. And the key thing to remember here is that texture is fixed. It's inherent to the soil that we're farming on. We cannot change it through our management practices, but we can learn how to work with it, and it will directly influence soil structure. So we know that large particles create large pore spaces. So up here, if we have a soil that's predominated by a lot of sand, we have these larger pore spaces, and that's going to impact water movement. Conversely, in clay, there's small particles, so really small pore spaces in between those particles, and so water is going to be held more tightly. So as we move from a coarse textured soil to a fine textured soil, the ability for our soil to retain water is going to go up, but the ability for water to move quickly and freely through it is going to go down. Similarly, the ability to hold nutrients in the soil increases with decreasing particle size. So a clay soil is going to have good nutrient retention, whereas a sandy soil is going to have a harder time holding onto nutrients and is going to be more prone to leaching. So we know that pore space also impacts oxygen and the availability of oxygen for roots and microorganisms, in addition to just physical space for roots to grow. So large pore spaces can contain more air and more space for roots. Small pore spaces, the opposite. So in a clay soil, we may have issues with aeration and room for root growth, whereas those things will be ample in a sandier soil. And the last kind of key thing that texture is going to inform for us is susceptibility to erosion and compaction. So a sandy, coarse textured soil is going to be more resilient. It's going to bounce back faster from tillage events compared to a finer textured soil, which is pretty liable to compact in a lot of, with the use of heavy machinery or a lot of tillage, and is more liable to erode. So one way we can think about this is coarser textured soils are kind of this magnet for air and space, and they've got this ability to be resilient against disturbance events, whereas our clay soils are more of a magnet for water and nutrients, so they'll have an easier time holding on to those sorts of things. And soil texture can definitely be measured. The broadest scale you could look at would be a soil survey, which is a soil map, essentially, of the province. And you can look up just based on your location for general information about the soil that you're working on. This is not going to work if you are in an urban context or you have some sort of anthropogenic soil that's fill or been modified by people in a really significant way. You can also texture your soil by hand, and there's a video resource to that at the end of the presentation if you want to learn how to do that and the steps involved. And your soil texture can also be measured in the lab, and this will give you the kind of exact percentage of sand, silt, and clay And we recommend that folks do this. It's just a one-time purchase because your soil texture won't change. And if you do decide to go this route, you're going to want to take your samples based on some observation or some previously done hand texturing. So if you are farming on a field that you feel like is pretty homogeneous, it seems to drain uniformly, it responds to tillage in a really similar way, you could send in just one sample for your field. But if you've noticed variation in your field in the way that it feels or the way that it behaves, you may want to split the field into chunks and send separate samples in because you may be working with differently textured soils on one farm. So at this point, I'd just like to invite everyone to, if you have done a hand texture test or you do have results from a lab, let us know what texture your soil is. What are you working with?
Seems like maybe there's not a lot of texturing going on out there.
Yeah.
We also, I was just going to say, thank you, Carl Pearson, primarily clay-based. We also accept answers like that. So you don't have to give us an exact soil texture, but if you know where you are on that scale of fine textured and kind of being, clay-based, thank you. Lots of clay and sand.
Straight up sand.
Straight
Okay,
up
we got some
sand. That's
sandy
classic
soil.
real sand. Great. So we kind of have both ends. We have lots of people saying clay and lots of people saying sand. Nobody's on those mystical loams that we all want to be farming on.
Oh, we got triple clay.
Sandy, lots of clay. Interesting. Okay, great.
Yeah,
Um,
a great amount of variation.
yeah.
Okay,
Um,
thanks for.
it's a great place to start. I would definitely heavily emphasize Ray Lonnie's recommendation here is doing that one time soil test and really understand what you're working with to inform your management practices. But it's awesome that you guys, this is largely seems like it's coming off of intuition as to what people have experienced. Great.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the folks that popped something in the chat there. So soil texture is going to really directly influence our next property, which is soil structure. And soil structure refers to the organization of soil particles into aggregates or into clumps. And these aggregates are stuck together by organic matter and other sticky substances that are exuded by roots and microbes and other soil fauna. So we can see in this photo on the left-hand side, this is an unstructured soil, so there's very little aggregation, whereas in this photo on the right, you can see these little clumps, and those are aggregates. That's what we're talking about. And aggregates provide a lot of benefits to soil function. So they allow finer textured soils to possess a lot of the positive attributes that we normally attribute to a coarser textured soil. So you can see that this has changed the pore size and space. So even in a fine soil, now we're going to have improved drainage and aeration in a way that may have previously been a problem. And these aggregates are also important in storing carbon. So you can think of aggregates as little houses for soil carbon that are protecting them against processing by soil microbes. And structure is directly affected by our management, unlike texture. So this is something through our decisions we can either build or degrade. And so when we think about what's influencing soil structure, there's a couple of things we don't have control over, like texture. Clay and finer textured soils are going to be more likely to aggregate. They have a greater capability to aggregate than those predominated by sand. So you could think of the beach. You don't normally see kind of clumps of sand. They're individual grains. Also climate. So in places where there's a really intense rainfall or it's quite warm, both of those things are going to impact aggregate formation and stability. And then there are the things that we do impact. So tillage is the #1 management activity that will have a large influence on soil structure. And tillage physically breaks apart aggregates and degrades soil structure. So that's like a mechanical degradation. And then the last three on this list, organic matter, soil biology, and soil cover, all have to do with influencing that glue that holds aggregates together. So soil fauna like earthworms and microbes can release compounds that stick aggregates together. And then soil cover becomes important because we know roots are exuding compounds that have similar effect. They're sticky and clumping these soil particles together. And then they also are, soil cover is also protecting this soil against this kind of climate factor, potentially protecting the soil against heavy rainfall. And so from a soil health perspective, like if we weren't thinking about anything else that our farm needs, we would be farming aggregates. That would be our main goal in kind of promoting and improving our soil health. And so in framing this case study, we have some questions that y'all submitted. Thank you for doing that. And one that we got was the best and most efficient way to improve clay soils. This is a great question. And then we also got a question about tips and thoughts on no-till farming. And I'm going to kind of briefly touch on this as it relates to clay soil, but it's such a big topic. We could talk for days about this alone. So I've just provided some of my favorite resources in thinking about this at the end of the presentation. So here we go. Let's get into this portion here. And we're going to kind of collectively imagine that we're all farming together on a clay soil, which it sounds like for some of you, that's your reality. And given what we've talked about in the soil texture kind of session of this, I'd like you to throw in the chat some ideas about what you feel like would be a benefit and what would be a challenge about this farm. Some of the other assumptions we can make about our collective farm is that we're managing it organically, we're small scale, less than 5 acres, and it's an annual production. So just take a moment, if you have any ideas about what would be hard about this farm, or what things you would be excited about. Yeah, Rachel says it holds water, definitely, compacts easily, also true. Right, Julian, we're gonna have to think about drainage as our pore spaces are pretty small. Both of those are really key. High fertility and late entry date, absolutely. So we have a good capability to retain nutrients, but because of the aforementioned water issues, we might have a late start to the season. CEC is good. CEC is cation exchange capacity, which also speaks to our nutrient retention. And then another compaction mention. And then, yeah, so physical space for soil fauna and roots will definitely be an issue. All right, thanks for all of those, folks. I came up with basically the same. You really hit on the key points here. So yeah, water, nutrient, and organic matter retention are going to be high in the soil, and we have a high potential for aggregation. We have an opportunity to build structure here. But some of the challenges are going to be related to water movement and aeration, compaction, and erosion, and that tillage is going to be especially tricky here. So the first thing let's think about is water management on our clay soil. And our thinking about this is going to change throughout the year as precipitation changes. So in fall and spring, there's likely to be a lot of rain at the same time that we're going to have a lot of mechanized tasks on our plate. So we're going to be planting and terminating cover crops, potentially preparing the ground for planting. And the soil is going to be very susceptible to compaction and structural degradation when it is wet. So soil in general is more likely to compact when it's wet, and this is especially true on a clay soil. So this is going to be challenging, right? Like we want to try and hold what would be best for our soil, but then we've also got all of these competing kind of interests, like keeping our crop plan on schedule and managing all of the other logistics of the farm. So some of these challenges can kind of be managed by one, just not pushing the season too hard. So trying to align our crop selection with our soil type. So we maybe don't want to plan for some really early crops where we know we're going to have to get in to do some tillage in really rainy months. And we're also going to want to monitor soil moisture when we are deciding to till, to tell if things are dry enough. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. And this would also be a great opportunity in the chat if folks want to, those of you who are farming on clay soil, if you want to talk about some of kind of just the cultural practices or observational techniques that you use to decide when tillage seems all right. One such measure is just doing one pass and looking at the state of the soil after you've disked just one kind of row. Is the soil clumping into, are you like cutting it into these large chunks that aren't falling apart? If you've got huge clods after one pass, that soil is really very wet. Before you even hop on the tractor, you could dig a hole that's like about 1 foot deep, and you could just look at the soil water. Do you have a lot of water coming up from the bottom and you feel like that's going to be wet all the way down and there's really not a lot of drainage happening in there? Or is the soil just wet kind of on the surface? Another technique that I know about is just grabbing a clump of soil, kind of forming a ball in your hand and tossing it in the air and hitting it with the palm of your hand. And the metric I've used, although this was on a sandier soil, was if I could get that ball of soil to disintegrate within 3 hits with the palm of my hand, I was good to go. There's other kind of, if your tractor gets stuck, it's too wet. So it's all about kind of developing your own intuition and talking to other farmers about what metrics they're using to kind of play this balance back and forth between needing to get the ground ready to go and also keeping in mind that your soil is pretty vulnerable at this point. The other thing we could think about here is using season extension techniques that are going to change the hydrology of the soil to give us drier areas to work with. So using greenhouses or hoop houses for early or late production would be a good way to keep off of our fields in really wet times and give us a little bit of breathing room in those covered spaces. Now, if we move into the summer, so this is when we're reaping some of the benefits of this clay soil because we've got really good water retention. So we're going to have a bit more drought resistance in our fields. And this is going to impact our irrigation strategy. So irrigation can be done in longer sessions and less frequently in a clay soil than a sandy soil. We want to definitely observe what's happening out there. So if we're using sprinklers on a clay soil, we really want to avoid surface ponding. So even though we might be irrigating for a longer amount of times, we want to make sure that it's at a lower intensity so that the water is infiltrating into the soil just as fast as we're watering it. If we get a lot of surface water, that can kind of sheet off and run off even to different parts of our field, but that is causing erosion and degrading soil structure. So drip irrigation is particularly effective in these soils because we have way more sideways transfer of water than we would in a sandy soil. So you can see that depicted in this photo. On the left, this is a sandy soil, and you can see where the drip emitter is. Oh, sorry. The water is going kind of straight down. Whereas in the clay soil, there's more water going sideways, which is going to be really helpful when we're germinating seeds. And then in the winter, especially in the Pacific Northwest, this is when we get the majority of our rainfall. And in a clay soil, that water is going to have a hard time making its way through the soil at the same rate that it's coming down. So we're at risk for erosion and just physical compaction from the raindrops. And so the first thing we can do is to keep the soil covered with either a cover crop or a mulch. And like in the spring and the fall, heavy machinery is going to be liable to compact the soil when it's wet, so not ideal for winter production. But again, we can use greenhouse production to kind of change the soil hydrology. Okay, so beyond water, we want to think about organic matter management. And one way we can do this is by thinking about the additions and losses of organic matter in our system. So some additions would be crop residues, manures, composts, whereas losses are going to come from erosion and tillage events, which are going to expose a lot of this carbon to microbial activity. And those microbes are going to respire it as CO2 back into the atmosphere. So I'm sure we've all heard many times about the benefits of organic matter, and there are so many. But for our case specifically, like we talked about when we build structure, clay soils have can take on these good attributes of coarser textured soils when they are well structured, and we need organic matter to be the glue to make that happen. So we can promote aggregate formation here. And we're also providing food and habitat for microbial activity, which can help us with soil fertility and improving nutrient cycling, which Amy will talk a bit more about in the second half here. And the last attribute that we'll talk about is tillage. So we know that tillage destroys aggregation, which on a clay soil is especially important. And even if we don't eliminate it completely, we can think about ways to reduce the frequency, depth, and intensity. So a lot of this can come from tool selection and some of those more cultural practices of deciding when and when not to till. We can move to things like permanent beds, which then eliminate the tractor tire weight on top of growing spaces, which can help us alleviate compaction. We can tailor our tillage to the crop needs. So when we're transplanting a crop, the seed bed doesn't have to be as fine as it would for like a carrot seed or something where it's important that we have good seed to soil contact. So doing those kinds of either choosing a different tillage implement or a different amount of passes depending on what crop you're planting. And then really trying to keep off the fields when it's wet is going to help us with this compaction issue. So one benefit that tillage does give us, at least in the short term, is that it helps warm and dry the soil, which is important for getting the season moving in the spring. And so we can think about different ways to achieve the same end. And we talked a bit about greenhouse and hoop house for our early crops, but in the field, we could also think about tarping and occultation techniques to get the soil warm and dry without getting our tiller out there. And then lastly, given their soil structure concerns and the scale, it's not a huge farm, we could look into ways of reducing our tillage kind of systematically to build a whole kind of farm production system that doesn't rely on tillage, but on other methods that will give us similar outcomes. And so in our organic vegetable farm, the things that we're tilling for primarily are to prepare the ground for planting, to terminate our cover crop, and to manage our weeds. Those are kind of the three pillars. There are other reasons, but those are the big three. And there are resources provided at the end that are going to outline some different systems that have been developed with these tasks in mind in particular, but these are just some key considerations. So we will need to select some scale appropriate tools that are going to help us improve aeration and drainage. So a broad fork is one that comes to mind, some way to introduce air, which is going to help us warm up the soil and also help water move through. And then we're really going to have to prioritize soil cover. And this is going to be important for weed management, but also for friability. So because we wouldn't be fluffing up the soil close to planting time in a heavy soil, things are going to get a bit more compact. So using cover crops whose roots will help kind of create larger pore spaces, and then mulches, which will help protect from impact from rainfall, and then also frequent successions to keep that ground covered will all help us improve kind of the tilth and friability component. And then organic matter inputs, as always, are important, but here in particular for nutrient cycling, and then for the same friability concerns, just like how do you actually get seeds and plants in the ground if you don't have that tillage component. All right, so just to sum this up here really fast, when we're farming on a clay soil, we're really concerned about building soil structure, and we can do that by adding organic matter, tilling judiciously, keeping the soil covered, managing soil water, and selecting crops to the soil needs. So that's talking about that component of crop timing and crop selection. Potentially things that need a really fine seed bed could be limited, whereas a lot of transplanting and crops that need less tillage in general might be a better fit. And we can do some investigation to scale appropriate tools and methods to work with this clay soil, and then just monitor everything that we try along the way. So a lot of good observations and note keeping and talking to folks with similar situations and similar soil types. So we are right on schedule here for everyone to kind of stretch their legs and take a little bit of a break. So we're going to come back at 10:50 and we'll hand this over to Amy, who will take us on to case study 2. Amy, do you have anything to say before we take a break here?
Nope, I think that's great. I am astonished that we are on time. I'm very impressed. Nailed it to the minute. Yeah, I think coming back at 10:50, that sounds good. And we'll just, I guess, shut off videos for the next 4 minutes, and then regather at 10:50 with case study 2.
All right, we'll see you in a few.
Sounds good.
Amy, I'm just going to stop screen sharing so that you can pull up your slides.
Great, thank you. Oops. Okay. I feel like I always mess this up a bit.
It does take a moment.
Okay. Can you confirm that you can see the 5-minute break slide?
That looks great. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So we're at 10:51. So I'm going to get started here. Okay. Oops. Great. Case study 2. And before we get into it, let's start off with those poll questions. Raylani or Georgia, would you mind launching the poll for me? Great. Okay, so this poll is all about your nutrient management decisions. And this is what this second case study will be about. How can I not move this? There we go. Well, we have a solid number of people here who are using soil testing for nutrient management decisions. This is amazing. My presentation might be very simple for all of you, but hopefully I can still provide some information. And I think we still have some answers trickling in. Wow, a fair number of you are using cover crops. That's awesome. Also using lots of compost, lots of specialty fertilizers.
I'm curious, those of you who answered other to the second choice, if you wouldn't mind sharing that more specifically in the chat, what your other fertility is.
I would also like to know that too. Okay, so we have most of the answers in here. Whoops, how does this keep happening? Okay, yeah, okay, so we can all see, so it looks like a bunch of you are using soil testing to inform your nutrient management decisions, and that's awesome. It'll be great after this workshop to see if some of the information that I'm providing today is helpful to kind of go with what you're already doing. And then in terms of cover cropping, so a bunch of you are cover cropping and a bunch of you are using compost. That's great. And as Raylani said, Raylani, I can't see the chat right now. Did anybody type into the chat what their other nutrient sources were?
They did. We have one person using Korean natural farming methods and then a liquid seaweed.
Cool. Awesome. So the liquid seaweed, yeah, I guess it depends on how you're using that. I'd probably throw that into like the specialty fertilizer or fertigation category. But even Raylani and I had some diverging opinions as to what is considered specialty fertilizer and what's fertigation. So that makes sense. Awesome. Cool. That is great. I love that we're using lots of cover crops. That makes me very happy. And I'm also very impressed that 13 of you are doing soil testing. Okay, so I'm going to close that. So continuing. So I'm going to start off with introducing the questions that I will be focusing on in my case study. And the questions, these are directly from all of you. So thank you for submitting your questions. So question 1, we're going to piece this apart. So we're being careful to rotate our crops for maximum soil health, pest management, and nutrients. But with short crops like lettuce and on a small scale farm, it's impossible to have a proper rotation grown once every 3 to 4 years in one bed. Same thing for arugula and other short days to maturity brassicas. Are we arming? I think that's meant to be in the typo. I think it's supposed to say harming, or basically, are we doing something negative for the soil by planting short crops like these salad mixes a few times in a 3-year period on the same bed? Would it be okay in the same bed in the same year? This is a great question, and I love that it was super detailed. So I'm going to break this apart, and basically this question is asking about crop rotations from kind of these these three different areas. The first one is from a pest management perspective, so I've highlighted that here. I am not a pest management expert, but the input that I would have here is that we really want to think of crop rotations on this annual basis. So this means rotating crop families or groups through an area each growing season. So that means you can have that same crop or family group in one field for one season. So that would be kale for an entire season, or a pumpkin for an entire season. Or you could grow multiple successions of lettuces or radishes in the same bed or in the same area for one season. And then you want to rotate this crop family or crop group away from this field or this block for about 4 to 8 years. It's a very large number of years. That's a generalization, but it really depends on what pest or disease you're kind of trying to manage with that rotation. If you already have clubroot in your fields, you're in for a minimum of an 8-year rotation because you're dealing with something that already exists. If you're dealing with other pests, you can often get away with a shorter rotation in the 4-year range. I'd say that's kind of about the minimum. The length of rotation really depends on that pest or disease loading. And this is a great question for Drew Yates, who will be doing a session, I believe, next week. Okay, same question, but for maximum soil health. So the answer here is yes, crop rotation and diversity is great for soil health. Basically, we want lots of basically crop residues through like root residues, above ground residues, all of that ending up in the soil. For example, when we harvest broccoli, we just take off that broccoli and the rest of the plant is going back into the soil. And then we want a corn plant and those residues going back into the soil. And basically all these plants provide different impacts on the soil. So yes, crop rotation is great for maximum soil health. But again, we're thinking of that crop rotation on that annual basis. So go ahead and grow your lettuce in that one block for that season. That's a lettuce rotation, or that crop group is there, and then rotate out of it for the duration of your crop rotation. From a nutrient regeneration standpoint, basically, as long as you're adding what the crop needs at the beginning of the season, or I guess as you're going throughout the season, so you could be topping up with like side dressing or adding some more compost before your next succession, then the nutrient aspects of crop rotation are basically a small part of the importance of that practice. It really is kind of a soil health, but primarily a pest management perspective. So that's a great question. Question 2 is, any recipes for bioferments or soil amendments would be great. I've had downy mildew for a number of years and I can't seem to get rid of it, even though I move my plants. Any recommendations for soil? So I'm going to use my get out of jail free card here because I am not a pest person. I'm a soil and nutrient management person. So unfortunately, I cannot comment on managing downy mildew. I recommend, again, I suggest bringing this question to Drew Yates next week. So there's my get out of jail free card. I will not be able to answer that today. However, I will be focusing on kind of this request for recommendations for soil amendments and recommendations for soil. So I'll really be looking into how we can make some of those decisions. Question 3, do you have any insight into soil management in the city and urban farming context? And so I'm going to keep that in mind today as we're going through. I will point out where maybe we want to change what we're doing if we're doing it specifically in the city, or, urban farming. I just also think of that as like small parcel farming. So yeah, we'll get to that. Question 4, this is also a nice nuanced question. I'd like to know how to thoroughly and cost effectively assess the soil fertility of a piece of land, how to build fertility along with good soil structure. We already know that. Raylani just taught us all about that. And over what time span. Cover crops, mineral additions, what's effective but cheap. I value quality for an appropriate cost, don't get me wrong, but I think there are many ways of building soil fertility. And yes, there are many ways. And it totally depends on where you are, what you have access to, what your climate is conducive to. Can you grow a cover crop, or does the frost come and kill it before it can even get established? Do you have really wet shoulder seasons where a cover crop wouldn't even happen? So yes, depends on where you are, and there are lots of different ways to go about that. Sorry. That didn't work. But basically, we're going to get through this. That question is really what this case study is balanced on, and that I feel like that question really kind of summarized what some of those other questions were asking. So in summary, out of those 4 questions that we got, the summary question that I will be trying to answer or tackle today is, how can we provide crop nutrients, or basically building soil fertility while building soil structure? So these crop nutrients or fertility, there's kind of two aspects to that. So there's actually like providing the nutrients and monitoring some indicators in our soil. That's our NPK, sulfur, magnesium, calcium, some micros that are important to manage or monitor, and then measuring our indicators, which would be our organic matter, our pH, and our EC. EC is electrical conductivity. That's a measure of salt content. And then this other aspect, so organic matter, or adding carbon to our soil constantly is a good thing. And sources of that are cover crops, compost, manures, crop residues. I'm sure there's some that I'm missing. And then while building soil structure. So soil structure also overlaps with this constant addition that we're aiming for of organic matter, and then also that soil disturbance aspect that Raylani discussed previously. So I will be focusing on these nutrients and indicators and a little bit of organic matter, really kind of just talking about that we want to be constantly adding organic matter to our soils, and I'll really be focusing on those nutrients and some soil testing. So, meeting crop nutrient requirements. The outline of what we're going to be going through today. First step is soil test. Second step, establish your crop requirements. Third step, assess your amendment options. Fourth, calculate your amendment application rate. So this is going from what the crop needs and how much fertilizer or compost do I actually need to put on to meet those crop needs. Great, I made the slides guessing that I would want to say that. And then finally, adjusting our rates based on monitoring and probably some either follow-up soil testing, or as Raylani mentioned previously, just really kind of keeping a visual, keeping our visual inspections of our fields ongoing, and really just noticing what's happening when we tweak our systems. So we're going to start off here with the first step is soil testing. I am also a big fan of not reinventing the wheel, and so a lot of my slides today have screenshots of the resources that I want all of you to go and check out and learn from. And basically I find that oftentimes my role in these workshops or doing extension isn't necessarily to always have the answer, but to guide you to the resources that do have the answers. I think that there are so many people out there kind of saying the same things, and I think that if you can know what resources I've personally vetted and I know are telling you the right things, I think that that's kind of what my role is. And so there will be lots of screenshots in my presentation today. So we're starting off here at the BC Ministry of Agriculture website on their soil nutrient testing kind of like landing page. And we're going to start off with, we're going to do some soil sampling and we're going to take the samples. So we're going to click through there, and basically we're going to start off focusing here on some methods, so sample timing and depth, and the tools that we could use for that. And remember, we're going to share these slides with you, so there will be clickable links on these slides. Another great resource, so besides the BC Minister of Agriculture, is Oregon State University Extension Service. They have a lot of resources geared towards small farms, small organic farms, vegetable production, and a huge reason why I'm a fan of them isn't just because they do great science and great extension, but also because their climate is very similar to ours. And so we don't want to be looking up resources that are based for farms in Kansas. That is an entirely different climate, and we will be getting misinformation. And so I highly recommend Oregon State University resources. Okay, so we're going to do like a who, what, when, where, why. We've already captured the why, and this is going to be completely out of order, but so soil testing, when to sample. So we want to test in the fall, and we want to do this after we've harvested, before it rains. You can also test in the spring, but I'm going to convince you why we test in the fall and why it's more efficient to just do all of our sampling in the fall. But no matter when you choose to sample, whether that's in the fall, post-harvest, before the rains, or in the spring, before planting, you just always want to test at the same time of year so that those tests are comparable. And in terms of frequency, if you're a beginning farmer, I'd start with every year, move to every couple of year check-ins, or you would want to soil test as needed for diagnostics. So where to sample, a big part of this is that you really want to be sampling in your management unit. Since you can see here, those resources I give you will walk you through like how many samples you want to get into making one composite sample, but you can see here that somebody's divided this field into, here's sample 1 with all of its subsamples, and sample 2 might be this eroded spot over here, and sample 3 might be this low spot over here. And basically what this is showing is that we want to sample places that are different or that will be managed different. And so this is different. My guess is that this whole field will probably be managed the same or planted to the same crop. And specifically tips for sampling at a small scale. I guess not specific to a small scale, but always we test greenhouses separately. So that's kind of like a definite rule, but then at a small scale. So we're testing by management unit. And the important part here is that usually our soil sampling resources will tell us that we can sample 5 to 10 acres at a time, and those can all be in one sample. But for a lot of us, that's literally 5 to 10 times the size of your farm. And your farm might actually have multiple management units in it. An example of that is small farms will often manage by like a field or a block that they're rotating crops through, and so you might actually want to sample those fields separately. In an urban context, you could be sampling your urban farm sites separately. Basically, however your management or differences go, you want to be sampling it at that scale. I recommend erring on the side of too many samples the first time you test, and if you get test results back that are telling you that those sites in those areas are actually pretty similar, go ahead and test them all together in future years. And this is because one sample is an average for the area you've tested. So if you're testing 2 areas and they're different, or you plan on managing them differently, but you've tested them all together and you got one test back, and that test is what you're using to make management decisions from, you want that kind of that report to be accurate to where you're making decisions. So continuing on with our methods, we're going to sample 2 depths, so 0 to 15 centimeters and 15 to 30. I'll be coming back to this image again in a moment. When you go to these resources that I've suggested or online, you'll see really cool photos of these tools, which are soil probes, and this is what we use in research to soil sample, but don't be dismayed. You do not need a soil probe to be out there sampling. You'll probably use a shovel or a trowel. You definitely want to make sure that you're sampling in a way that it's representative of that depth that you're sampling, but don't be concerned about not having a probe. The shovel or the trowel will work great. So now what are we testing for? So back to this photo. So you can see on the top, a basic soil fertility test. What this generally takes into account would be phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc, copper, boron, magnesium, calcium. Those are some basics. If you're doing more complicated diagnostics, you might look for something further than that. And then some indicators. So our EC, or electrical conductivity again, our pH and our organic matter. And then the other test that you want to add to that and be testing for at both depths is your nitrate nitrogen, or NO3. This is nitrate nitrogen. So it's one form of nitrogen. It's a plant available form, so it's what our plants take up, but it's also highly mobile in the soil. And I will be coming back to that in a moment to discuss why we treat our nitrate nitrogen different than kind of this basic soil fertility test. So I'm going to give you an all you need to know about nutrient cycles in 5 minutes, or however quickly I can talk through these slides. Crash course nutrient cycles. So here we have our farm season. We have our spring, our summer, our fall. Again, I've alluded to that we have these kind of wet, really rainy shoulder seasons, and then we have soil processes kind of happening throughout the season. What we do as farmers, we add nitrogen into our soil, and that could be in a slow release form, like from a compost or a manure, or a cover crop. It could be a quicker release form, like from a blood meal or a feather meal. But any of those forms will basically kind of go through this process. They'll turn into this plant available nitrate form, and the plant will take that up. If we apply too much, or if things are slow releasing after our crop has required that nitrogen, then that's left in our field at the end of the season. The rains come, and as I've alluded to previously, nitrate nitrogen is highly mobile in our soil, and this will leach, and it will not be carried forward. So this test here, it's called post-harvest nitrate. As I mentioned, it leaches with rainfall, and it won't be carried into the next season. And so if we measure this, a high post-harvest nitrate value, sorry, that should say NO3, it's an inefficient use of our nutrient applications. That could be like agronomically a waste of our money, and it's also bad for the environment. So having nitrates in our aquifers and our drinking water is not good. However, and so a low post-harvest nitrate value, that's definitely better, but you also want to think that if you have a low post-harvest nitrate value and you also had low crop yield, which can't be explained by like weed pressure, pest pressure, irrigation issues, it could actually hint at not enough nitrogen, especially if you tie that in with some of your like field observations throughout the season. So this is what we like to call, this soil test in the fall is our report card. So how did we do? Did we leave a bunch of nitrate in the field at the end of the season and kind of have that inefficiency happen? Or did we not have enough plus have low crop yields and maybe we came up short? Or were we all good? We had a bit of nitrates at the end of the season, good crop yields, and we planted a cover crop to take up that nitrate. So this is our report card. This is in contrast to, I'm going to use phosphorus and potassium here as an example, but you could also think of this as the same as like adding magnesium or boron or other nutrients like that. So the difference here is that we add these inputs, the plant is going to take some up, and what's left in the season, or sorry, what's left in the soil at the end of the season will actually carry forward into the next season. There are exceptions here, but general rule, we're going to carry that forward. And so our soil test here in the fall is actually what's available, asking this different question, which is what is available for future plants. And so those are two different questions. And so nitrate gets treated differently. However, a very important note here is that very high soil phosphorus is inefficient and it's an environmental concern. And we do have new regulations in BC for mandatory soil testing to monitor this post-harvest nitrate and phosphorus in our soils as well. So when you get these slides after, I encourage you to go click this link, go check out the Agricultural Environmental Management Code, and just there'll be maps and there's like these phase-in process of the different years of when different kind of regions of our province are getting phased in. So I encourage you, go check out those maps, go see when or if you'll be affected, if you're at the scale that's being affected, and figure out if you need to do some soil testing. And you can see the values, the threshold. So I talked about these like high post-harvest nitrates, low, and I didn't give you any values. You can find all of these on the website. Pop quiz. So in our climate, we've just established that we don't directly test the soil for nitrogen to inform in-season like amendment choices. So I don't test in the spring how much nitrogen is there and how much do I need to add. But we can do that for phosphorus and potassium, as I just discussed. Does anybody know what we can test for in the soil as a source of nitrogen that we could kind of use as like a predictive value? Because obviously there's still some nitrogen there, and I'm curious if anybody has an answer to that. And Raylani, I can't actually see the chat. Would you be able to read out some answers to me if people have any suggestions? Great. So if we're not testing for this plant available form of nitrogen, but we do have nitrogen sitting in the soil, and it's kind of like it's sitting in that slow release pool. And I already mentioned one of the other indicators that we would test. And Raylani talked about it quite a bit of like some of the other inputs that we would put into the soil. Does anybody have any guesses as to what that other pool in the soil would be that we would measure to kind of have some understanding of like the nitrogen supplying capacity that the soil would have? We don't have any brave soils. We don't have any brave souls, Raylani. No one's gonna guess. I think I can see chats.
Jenny has organic matter.
Yes! I wish I had prizes to give out. So Jenny said organic matter. Awesome. Soil organic matter. Great answer. So we have nitrogen sitting in soil organic matter. It sits there, it doesn't leach at the end of the season, and it will release nitrogen slowly over the course of the season. So that's kind of this like building up our soil fertility. So that's why we want to constantly be adding these carbon sources to our soils, is to be building this up. But it's not us directly testing nitrogen to see like what's available and how much we would add. So that's a great answer. Okay, great. So now we're into the who of soil testing, so who to send them to. But starting off with, this is actually getting into, we've collected the sample, we now understand why we sample in the fall. And kind of what we're going to test for. So this is, before we get into who we're going to send it to, what we're going to ask for is this basic fertility test. All the labs, that'll look a bit differently, but generally everybody's kind of testing for like your classic macros and a couple of those micros that are important in our climate. You want to make sure that it includes at least all of those nutrients and indicators that I've listed previously. Ask for the recommendations, at least for your first year, and just see what the lab comes back with for their interpretations. But I'm about to, in the next couple slides, I will give you some references for you to make your own interpretations from a basic test, so you can move away, depending on the lab, to interpret your soil test for you and be able to make some of those on your own. I don't really recommend any specific lab. I don't directly work with a lab in the work that I do, but here's a few. So PSAI out in Richmond is a classic lab that works with small farms quite often. TerraLink lab, or I think it's called the Plant Science Lab, but associated with TerraLink. Exova, now called Elements, is out in Surrey, and they're, I think, trying to ramp up their offerings for agricultural producers. And if none of these sound appealing to you for whatever reason, you can click on this link, and there are other options listed on the BC Ministry of Agriculture website. And the pricing between all of these, I've talked to, like, they're give or take $10 or $20 per sample at most. So I don't really think that pricing is like a huge difference between these, but I definitely encourage you to find a lab that you want to work with, because you want to keep testing at the same lab every time. So I said that I would interject a few things, differences for urban farm sites. So there is the importance of testing for heavy metals or petroleum products and things like that in some of our urban farm sites. I'm not going to get into this, but the City of Vancouver does have a resource for what you should be testing for and thresholds that you would compare that to make sure that you're not farming on contaminated land, or if you are, then maybe figuring out what you could do about that, maybe through like raised bed systems. So I encourage you to go check out this resource. Okay, so now we're into step 2, determining crop requirements. So what do our crops actually need? So now we've done our soil testing. So how do we decide what to apply? So for nitrogen, we're actually starting from scratch. We do a nutrient budget, and then we can also adjust that nutrient budget based on last year's post-harvest nitrate test. How did we do last year? And then for all the nutrients and indicators, we kind of do this like soil test interpretation where we're comparing something to a threshold, and it's this what's already there, and then how much additional of that nutrient do I need to apply to meet crop requirements. So nitrogen budget, it really just is this budgeting process. And so we start off with how much additional nitrogen do I need to apply? And that is a function of what does my crop require? And what's already in the soil? So in that organic matter pool, what might come available for nitrogen from that pool? Is my cover crop going to provide nitrogen? Is it a legume cover crop? Is it a grass cover crop? And then finally, if I'm already applying a compost, is my compost applying nitrogen? You can Yes, asking that question. I just want to add, though, you can see that I've screenshotted this equation from one of the resources that I've alluded to. I don't necessarily like that they've put nitrogen from your amendment as like a given that you're using it. In organics, like it's actually not a given that we're always applying compost and manures. So really you could take this out of here and rephrase it so that this equation is actually how much additional nitrogen do I need? And that nitrogen could come from a compost, it could come from a fertilizer, and then just having this equation be crop demand and nitrogen from our soil and our cover crop. A lot of us are applying compost, and so this equation structured like this is fine to work with for now. So starting off with crop demand, how do we figure that out? So this is a screenshot from this resource, Soil Fertility in Organic Systems, a guide for gardeners and small acreage farmers. This is from, I believe, a collaboration between Washington State University and Oregon State. So it's great, especially for small scale farmers. They deal in like square footage versus acres. Also though with the conversion available. And so basically we would go and we'd find a table. And so for example, there are low nitrogen requiring crops all the way up to high nitrogen requiring crops. And yeah, you can convert from this table into pounds per acre just by multiplying by 44. This is a fairly general kind of categorization of like low, medium, high. You can find other resources that are a bit more specific, but this is definitely a good starting place. Nitrogen from soil organic matter. This is definitely not as much of a joke as I wish it was. So nitrogen from soil organic matter is kind of this black box that scientists are currently trying to figure out, but we have some rules of thumb that we can use. So 3% organic matter generally provides about 100 to 150 kilograms of PAN, and PAN is plant-available nitrogen, aka that's our nitrate nitrogen per hectare. So how to use this rule of thumb? I would err on the low side of this estimate in your early years. So if you have 3% organic matter, err on the side of crediting, quote unquote, yourself 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and then use your observations to fine tune. If that's what you credit it as and you get through the roof post-harvest nitrates, then your soil organic matter might be mineralizing more than that. And then obviously we don't all just have 3% organic matter. A bunch of us, I'm sure, have way more than that, because we're organic farmers, or a lot of us are. So you would adjust accordingly. So if you have 1.5%, divide these values in half. If you have 6%, times these by 2. Super vague rule of thumb, but it's somewhere to start, and it's so variable that this really is something that just gets fine-tuned through farmer observation. Nitrogen from your cover crop, you want to be crediting cover crop if you're growing like a nice stand of legumes that has like beautiful growth in the spring. And a resource to do that is this OSU guide, Estimating Plant Available Nitrogen Release from Cover Crops. This is what it looks like, and the link was on the previous slide. This walks you through step by step exactly how you would be estimating a nitrogen contribution from a cover crop. This resource isn't going to help you credit. It doesn't walk you through like those tangible steps or the calculations, but I highly recommend this resource just as a, how do I use cover crops in my operation? What are the benefits? I definitely don't have time to get into that today, but I recommend this, at least having it in your kind of like toolbox of resources. So then your last one here is nitrogen from your amendments. And so this is generally like your compost and your manures. So the resource here is fertilizing with manure and other organic amendments. This is from the extension catalog. This is what it looks like. It is great. I'm obsessed with this one. I read through it quite a bit, and it will definitely walk you through actually crediting compost and manures for some nitrogen. So that's our nitrogen budget. So as I mentioned, we treat that one completely different than how we treat our other soil nutrients. So we can kind of like lump together phosphorus and potassium next. So we're going to go back to that BC Ministry of Agriculture website, and we're going to go click on this information and resources for soil phosphorus and potassium. Here's the link directly. And we're going to start, so you would normally start here. You would convert your test results to the methods that are used in this interpretation scheme. But today we're going to go look at that interpretation, and then we're going to come back, and hopefully that'll help you understand why we have to do this conversion. So in this document you will see kind of, this is a general I call it like an interpretation table basically. So this is the value that you got back on your soil test. So you just soil tested and you got it analyzed by TerraLink and they sent it back, and you would want to plug your number in here. You want to make sure that you're using the table that's specific for your area, and then you go in and see what crop group you're growing. This is where it gets a bit complicated for small scale farmers, but you can kind of generalize, and you want to generally be aiming for, if you have something from crop group 5, you want to be aiming to be amending to that group. You don't want to amend down. Like I wouldn't, if I had a field that had things from both of these groups, I wouldn't amend to this one. I would amend to the higher one. But there's a catch. So this part is what I mentioned previously. So this is based on a certain extraction method. And so this is where we go back, and all the labs are using different extraction methods, and so we can't compare like a TerraLink phosphorus test to a PSAI phosphorus test. We have to convert to make those equivalent. So you're going to go download this Excel spreadsheet, and you're going to select the lab that you use to do the soil phosphorus test. You're going to plug in those values, and so you'll recognize, so this is, I mentioned previously, Exova used to be what the lab is named. The lab is now Elements, and they use a modified Kelowna 94 extraction method, and you're going to type in, so this is hypothetically, we tested and the lab gave me back a 70 ppm using this extraction method, and then this value over here is my Kelowna extraction method, and this is what I'm going to use and take back to my table. So what value is that? Okay, 87. So now I have a question for the crowd. Is anybody here farming in any of these regions? I feel like there should be a lot of yeses.
You might want to just read them.
Okay, sorry.
Small.
So there's Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, the Okanagan, the Kootenays, Kamloops, Williams Lake, and Quesnel. I feel like it's all of BC. And can somebody tell me what's a primary crop that you're growing? Raylani, can you read me an answer? Okay.
Yeah, we have garlic. We have flowers. We have another garlic.
Great. Okay, so I just found garlic on this table. So we have garlic here. And then hypothetically in that last one, I said that we had got a 70 ppm answer, which is we'd use the converter to go to 87. So now can somebody, I hope this is big enough on everybody's screen. So we're growing garlic, and we're on a farm that's in one of these regions, and we did a soil test, and we converted it to 87 ppm. So we would go over here and we'd find that. Can somebody tell me, oh yeah, and this is also, so this is recommended P2O5 to apply. Can somebody answer this question here? According to this table, how much P2O5 in kilograms per hectare does that farm want to apply for garlic? And Raylani, can you read out any answers? Okay. You can also ask.
40?
Yeah, I think that's the right answer. Let's look at this. Is that so? Somebody said that, or is that you, Raylani, answering?
No, Alex and Katie both say 40. They agree.
Great. Okay, let's see. Okay, so just to confirm, so I did see garlic on this list here, and I said specifically kilograms per hectare, and I said 87. So yes, I'd be in the 75 to 100. So yeah, I would be adding 40 kilograms per hectare of P2O5. Great answer. And then this question here, I was hoping to go through some calculations of actually making those applications, but unfortunately I'm supposed to stay to 20 minutes today, which I am sure I am not already, so we're going to ignore that question.
Amy, I have a really quick question.
Yeah, of course.
Few people said flowers, but I don't think they said flowers, see flowers on these lists. Do you have a recommendation for which group they would fall into?
So that's a great question. I don't have an answer for that, but I would say, I'm just trying to think if there's like an equivalent here. Flowers span so many different families of crops, and so like if you had like a filler flower that was kind of in like your grasses category, like that's the interpretation I would use. And then if you have a flower, like I think there's a lot of people using like amaranth and things like that, then you could be interpreting for something similar to that would be like Swiss chard and things like that. Raylani, do you have any input here as to what category a flower would fall into?
I don't. I think I would say the same thing. There's a bunch of different plant families, and it would be something similar where they would be broken up depending on the flower type. Some of the more experienced flower growers in the group, maybe if you have a resource for managing fertility for flowers, you could share that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm definitely not an expert in the realm of flowers. Yeah, I think your best bet or your initial could just be thinking of what crop group that flower type falls into, and then also doing that monitoring over the long term. So if you interpret it and you're applying say 50 or 60 kilograms per hectare of P2O5, and you do that for a few years and you soil test and your phosphorus is going through the roof, then you need to back off on your phosphorus applications, or vice versa. If you're amending at this rate and your phosphorus is dropping over the long term, then like I would boost that up. These interpretation schemes really are just kind of like, this is where you should start, and it really is like monitoring over the long term as to how we kind of fine tune and make things work for us on our land with the inputs we're using and with the crops that we're growing. So that's a great question, and I wish I could get a bit more specific about that. And I just want to point out here that in terms of like kind of really coming back to trying to answer that crowd question that I had that is informing this presentation today. So that building fertility thought. So when you're soil testing, inherently that if you're soil testing at quite low phosphorus, your interpretation will tell you to be putting on a bunch more phosphorus and really building that fertility. Like this is not the amount of phosphorus that your crop uses in that season. And once you've built that, you will be slowly heading up to these categories up here. And once you're testing in these categories, kind of like above 50, above 75, you start to basically only add as much phosphorus as what your crop is removing. And you're kind of doing this like replacing crop removal point of view versus really like building your phosphorus soil reserves over the long term.
Amy, I just want to keep the time in mind.
Okay.
We're just a couple minutes until 11:30, and we do have a couple questions.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, perfect. So these next pieces are not exciting anyways. There's one slide that I want to go over. So basically, okay, that's great. I'm just gonna blow through these slides, and then there's one slide that I want to pause on, but we might not have to. Maybe I can fill it out for the people. Okay, so basically, that was nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then we've got these other things that we need to look at besides that. So for pH, you're gonna go to the website again, and you're gonna find these interpretations. Some of them are coming from Oregon and Washington. This is right on the BC Ministry of Agriculture website. Use those resources for these other nutrients, so sulfur, magnesium, boron, zinc, and copper. You're going to go back to the BC Ministry of Agriculture website and click on this basically interpretations guide. You're going to come up with this document. Please note the date on it so that you're not surprised as to what it looks like. It is a 1996 document. It is still kind of like the most current resource for BC. These are what the interpretation tables look like in this document. They're still functional despite looking like your grandma typed them, but they will be useful. And then organic matter, there's no ideal organic matter level or like threshold you're comparing to, but generally ranges from 5 to 10% will support kind of like the goals of your soil functioning. Assessing amendment options. I really wanted to go through this table with all of you, but we don't have to. But it's basically, I just really want to like drive home the point that like if we're using compost, we're getting nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, micros, and carbon all coupled together. We don't really get a choice. If we apply nitrogen, it's coming with phosphorus. Sometimes we want that, sometimes we don't. In contrast, when we apply a specialty fertilizer, we're just getting nitrogen and we're not going to get any of these other things. They also contrast in their release rates. So I will leave this with you. We won't go through it as a group today, but basically this is definitely worth thinking through as to what they provide. And if you're switching from a compost to a specialty fertilizer, you're giving up that carbon. Maybe you replace that carbon with a cover crop. That's all I'll say. This next part, I'm also kind of skipping over because I knew we wouldn't have enough time. Calculating amendment rates. This is going from that interpretation table that we just did into the actual kilograms of a fertilizer or compost you would apply. My tip here is mind your P2O5s and K2Os. So your fertilizer recommendations, that table was in P2O5. Fertilizer bags, that NPK on the side of a fertilizer bag, are actually nitrogen, P2O5, and K2O. It is not just NPK. But our compost and manures often deal with total phosphorus and total potassium. They convert back and forth. It's like you divide by 2.3 or times by 2.3. It's fairly straightforward, but that's my only tip. And then here are the references that you want to be using to make those calculations. There's quite a few. Find the one that works best for you. They're all great. I really want to talk about input costs, but I think that we should ask the group if they want me to talk about input costs from my research or if we want to like address some of those questions. People can type into the chat. Do people want me to answer questions or do people want to look at some input costs? And this is the end of my slides.
This is maybe another great option if Georgia, if you could put a link to the feedback forms for those folks who do have to go. We are at 11:30, but we would really appreciate if you just took like a minute or two to let us know what you thought. And if you can't stick around, that is great. We'll be here. Otherwise, really big thanks for coming.
Yeah, I'll put the evaluation form into the chat and then I'll also email it out. But yeah, we know that those things can slip out of mind. So if you could do that as soon as you can, that would be great.
Cool.
We have one direct message here that has a preference for input costs.
Cool. I'm stoked to talk about input costs, and then largely because so you guys will get these slides after. Okay, and somebody has a question. I'll go through these input costs really quickly so that you can understand them after, just because they're kind of in these box plots that aren't necessarily easy to read, and then you have them for comparison, because I think that this is like a really great resource. So I'll do this quickly. So this is a box plot of the compost costs that I measured in my study when I did my master's. And so I worked with farmers across the Fraser Valley, the Pemberton Valley, and on Vancouver Island. And as you can see, so basically this box just indicates like where the data points have landed, and these circles indicate the mean or the average cost for the group. And then these whiskers kind of go out to like your outliers or like your highest and your lowest values, and a true outlier would be sitting with a data point. So now that we know how this box plot works, basically the unit or these are all different composts that are being measured in these regions, and what we're measuring here is dollar per meter cubed or cubed meter of compost. Oftentimes we see like yards of compost, but because this is Canadian, this is in cubed meters or meters cubed, sorry. But basically what you can see is that making these input choices really depends on where you are and what you have access to. And so if you're in the Fraser Valley, our input costs are a lot cheaper here because there's a livestock industry. We have an urban center generating like food scrap composts. On Vancouver Island, we don't have the same situation, and composts were a lot more expensive there. And Pemberton's kind of in the middle. But the flip side to this is that like cover crops grow beautifully on Vancouver Island, and so Vancouver Island farmers can be swapping out their compost for growing some cover crops there. So I'll leave this with you. This is just something that you can compare to and reference as to like when you're making these decisions. I don't have a comment on this. It's just there's this huge variability that exists. And then dollars per kilogram of fertilizer. So this is fertilizer costs. So same thing in the Fraser Valley, in Pemberton, and on Vancouver Island. You can kind of ignore these two treatments. And I just saw Alex's question pop up, and I would love to address that. As you can tell, I want to talk about everything. Okay, so dollars per kilogram of fertilizer, ignore this. This was like a research treatment in the study, the low compost plus nitrogen. And so that's kind of like a standard, something that like we created, but this is like, we actually measured and asked farmers for their input costs. So this is what farmers are paying. You can see in the Fraser Valley, not that many farmers are using fertilizers because compost and manures are so accessible here. Whereas on Vancouver Island, I had 24 different fertilizers that I got input costs from, and of course they're highly variable, and still averaging about the same price as what we're seeing in Pemberton as well. Anyway, so this is just for your reference, and so that'll be, I think, kind of like a good comparison for people to compare to. Are you landing up here? Are you getting a good deal on your fertilizer? Obviously, this is also just dollars per kilogram of fertilizer. This isn't dollars per like unit nitrogen or unit phosphorus, which oftentimes is a better indicator. But these farmers were using relatively similar fertilizers, so for my analysis, this is what I went with. I'm going to answer Alex's question quickly while we're here. And I'm seeing it pop up, and then I'd love to go back to some of the other questions. So cover crops grow, they don't necessarily grow better on Vancouver Island, but basically up in Pemberton, farmers are farming like right up until winter hits, and winter hits very suddenly. And so like winter is hitting, crops are still in the ground if they haven't been taken out. So there's no really like beautiful shoulder season for a cover crop to establish. You need a cover crop to be established in the fall for it to survive winter and regrow in the spring. And so basically, oh yeah, okay. And I can see another question that is a great question as well. So you need a cover crop to establish in these shoulder seasons to basically provide growth and not compete with like growing in the summer with our cash crops. So in Pemberton, keeping with that example, basically farmers are growing right up until the end of August, end of September, basically end of October, and then the frost hits, and that's when their season ends. And there isn't really like this lush kind of like shoulder season for a cover crop to grow. In contrast to, and then it's the same thing in the spring. Basically, the snow melts and farmers are on their field. There's no like spring beautiful weather with like tulips popping up and things like that. Vancouver Island and Fraser Valley have very similar climates, so we have these beautiful shoulder seasons where cover crops can get established. They don't get winter killed as much over the winter. They grow again in the spring. You can have these, I got to sample the most beautiful cover crops on Vancouver Island that were like up to my knees and so lush and beautiful. So that's the Vancouver Island and Fraser Valley climates. And in the Fraser Valley, one of our audience participants has already answered the question. So are there any specific types of cover crops that are less desirable to migrating birds in the Fraser Delta? So in the Fraser Valley, even though we have the climate that's conducive to growing cover crops, we have these migrating birds that come through and basically devastate our cover crops that we've planted. So that's the issue in the Fraser Valley. Whereas on Vancouver Island, there might be a bit of that issue happening, but for the most part, like the farms that I was working with, they have the season and they don't have this weird kind of like pest pressure of waterfowl. Okay, so I answered that. And then I guess Georgia and Raylani, I have a question. So like I'm seeing questions pop up now, but I'm also curious if I should be answering these or if I should be like prioritizing like going back to answer questions that came up previously. I just want to like make sure I'm being like fair about this.
Yeah, there was one question from Carl. If you want to unmute yourself to ask a question directly, it does say in the chat, if I'm using natural sources of fertilizers, how do I determine what the element percentage is, like rock phosphate, for example?
Okay, great. Yeah, I can read that question now. So that's a great question. There's kind of like two different answers to that. So if you're using natural sources of fertilizers, I'm going to guess that, so I'm going to ignore the rock phosphate part of this question for now because that's actually like an extreme anomaly. So rock phosphate is a mineral-based product, and most of our natural, or like what you've called here as natural, lots of our organic sources of nutrients are actually like carbon-based. And so those are two, rock phosphate really is the anomaly kind of in the organic farming world. So to answer this question about natural sources of fertilizers would be things like feather meal, blood meal, compost, manure. You're going to go and check out these reference or these resources that I've dropped into some of those other slides, and they're going to kind of like walk you through figuring out either how to test your compost or manure and get like an actual analysis for that product, or in those resources it'll walk you through and kind of be like, okay, if you're using a poultry manure, was it like a broiler litter situation, or was it like a laying hen, was it composted or not? And so you'll get, these are what we call like book values, which are alternatives to actually like testing the resource or testing that amendment ourselves. And then in the case of feather meal and blood meal, those will be written on the side of the bag, and these resources will still like walk you through then how to determine the calculations of like the availability of those nutrients. And finally, the answer to the rock phosphate is the rock phosphate will still come with like the NPK on the side of the bag. Obviously, you can ignore the N and the K in that situation. It'll come with a % phosphorus, but there's different sources of like, there's different rock phosphate mines, and where the phosphorus comes from actually determines like the availability of that phosphorus. So my best recommendation there is to think of that as something that you're kind of, rock phosphate is something that you're adding in addition to, or more as like a building soil fertility over the long term. And it's because basically rock phosphate is so slow releasing. I would look into where your rock phosphate is coming from, Google and look up the availability of that phosphorus in that, and kind of like work through those calculations in addition to what would be on the side of the bag. I know that's not like the best answer, but rock phosphate really is the anomaly here, where we don't actually anticipate a lot of like in season or like that first year availability from it. It's something that a lot of farmers are adding to their fields and kind of like adding to their bank of fertility. Raylani, would you add anything to that?
No, I just saw that Art put in the chat that yeah, we have to keep in mind pH for sure with phosphorus availability. Yeah. So if your pH is above 6, which if you have been frequently applying lime or have a really high organic matter content, it may be, rock phosphate's not very available. I also, or do you have anything else to say on that one?
No.
Rachel, if you are still here, there was a point that you had put asters in the chat, and I'm wondering if you have that was a question about nutrient management for that, or if you were answering one of our questions about what you were growing. Just let me know if there's a question there.
And then I want to come back to, I think this person is Rose, might be the first name. So cover crops and migrating birds. So it's a great question. There are some farmers trialing this. I do not have an answer other than getting the birds seem to not like to be in fields where cover crop is like tall and well established. They seem to really be attracted to kind of when they come in and having like their appearance really coincide with kind of like the initial growth of a cover crop. And so my recommendation would definitely be, in terms of what cover crop to grow, it kind of seems like they don't like sunflowers as much, but those sunflowers can't be at like a 6-inch stage or even like a 12-inch stage. Like it has to be like, cover crops are gonna get really big. So it's not, okay, Art's saying hairy vetch is not as palatable as other cover crops. I've seen waterfowl still like devastate hairy vetch as well, but I think that like if Art's saying that, I would say that like put your hairy vetch with your maybe like sunflowers, get them in as early as possible. And as early as possible, that would be like maybe trying to get them in as August and maybe like interseeding some of these things. And so, yeah, basically trying to leave a stand of something in the field that's going to deter them. And so possibly instead of ripping out your kale plants and your Brussels sprouts and things like that at the end of the season, like interseeding those with your cover crop and leaving all of that standing in the field at the end of the year. Some things like this is basically, that's kind of what I've had either recommended to me or what I've seen work. It also, yeah, it really depends. I've seen farms that just have so much waterfowl pressure that there's almost nothing that it seems like they can do. But there are some suggestions going into the chat, that they like rye and wheat better than oats. So I would try that out. So maybe aiming for some oats, hairy vetch. Yeah.
Hey, Amy, just to follow up on Rachel's question,
Yeah.
she was saying that most flowers are asters, so it would be a good one to know in terms of looking at the nutrient needs. Would you have any, like going back to that list of plant categories, would you have any thoughts on which category asters would be in?
What does anybody, sorry, this is going to show my like lack of knowledge of like plant crops. I'm largely a soil person. What plant family would that be similar to?
Like lettuce and chicory.
Okay. So then I would say that's probably crop group 4. Because really, crop group 5 are like, these are our like heavy feeder crops. And whereas like crop group 2 and 3 really are kind of like our grasses and our covers. And so really, we just have kind of these two categories here. I think that, yeah, if that's our lettuces category, like that really is like on the lighter feeding end of like of our vegetable or cash crop. Yeah. So I'd say crop group 4 is my best guess. I will add to that it also depends on like how intensively you're growing and like what your yield goals are and things like that. These really are very general targets, and as I said, like it really is best to like start with your general target and do that follow-up testing and see if you're draining your phosphorus banks or if you're really building them up. Cool, Rachel, thank you for the feedback. That's good. I'm really just providing general guidelines, and it really sometimes is hard to not actually provide concrete answers. Cool. Yeah, do we have any other questions? Oh, sorry, I can go to we do have, so beyond the input costs, in the slides that you receive, you'll see some useful resources that we'll send out. And I've screenshotted like the OSU resources that I've looked at today. Like they have a full extension catalog of resources that are great and you can go through. My hint here is just looking at the publication date. Sometimes when you get into the older ones, like the science is just outdated. So looking for the 2015 or more recent is best. We don't have to give instructions on asking questions. And then yes, we're doing the feedback form. And if you have future questions, we definitely encourage you to send them straight to Georgia. And if you want, you can CC either Raylani or myself, and we can try to get an answer back to you. But really, Georgia would be your kind of like key contact point.
Yeah, so unless anyone else has any questions, which you can feel free to put in the chat. Thank you so much for coming and for joining on the first of the small farm sessions. It was great to have so many of you. I know it's hard to stay present during Zoom, so thank you for participating, and thanks so much Amy and Raylani for engaging with us through the chat and polls. That was really great. I feel like you just summed up a lot of what I learned in some of my grad level courses at UBC on soil, so that was fantastic. Yeah, and I popped the evaluation form into the chat. I'll send that out in an email too today, along with the slides, which have so many great resources. I'll also share the recording, and do feel free to send me an email if you have questions, and I can kind of direct you to resources, or we can follow up with Raylani and Amy. And yeah, if there's no other questions, oh, do we have a question? We have a note from Art. and is likely more critical than P and K for flowers and other crops in the area. Crop appearance and disease susceptibility are more dependent on N availability. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Amy or Raylani.
No, I think that, yeah, that's a good point. And especially like flowers are kind of out of my wheelhouse besides trying to like make some guesses as to how they would behave like vegetables. So art's feedback is definitely like art is such a great resource. I know that this was Raylani and I presenting today, but art has just, yeah, so much knowledge in this area. So anything that art says is definitely like a welcome addition to this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I say like you can email me questions, I will probably ask Art. So feel free to use us as a resource.
Awesome.
Yeah, and Art, did you want to share anything? I can see that your video is on.
No, I think it's been quite a useful session. I guess the comment I wanted to make was in terms of nutrients and the difficulty of managing nitrogen is really at the top of the list. And there's just two comments that I would like to make. The first is that I think nitrogen management should be viewed long-term. If you start going short-term and you're dependent on blood meal and feather meal for nitrogen sources, your costs are going to get be quite high, I think. Whereas if you can build your soil nitrogen supply, you can reduce the amount of additional nitrogen needed. And how do you do that? And I have, I grew up in quite a different era, and farmers, conventional and otherwise, were encouraged to evaluate and inoculate legumes and evaluate nodulation. And I don't hear nearly enough of that, especially for organic farmers. This is the way you build the farm nitrogen cycle, and you reduce the dependence on outside sources, many of which are too high in phosphorus to really be applying. So I guess that's my only addition to the discussion. Otherwise, it was quite complete. Oh, yes, there is one other question, one other point, and that is synchronization of nitrogen with crop availability. So at this point, we're beginning to see garlic growing out there. We might have overwintering brassicas. If you're growing overwintering grains, March or April, those crops are going to begin to need some nitrogen, and because the soils are too cold to be providing nitrogen, mineral nitrogen, whereas crops that are growing later on can take advantage of warmer soils and mineralization of that organic nitrogen that that Amy was talking about. So I think this idea of synchronization and the need for supplemental nitrogen is probably particularly critical for these early crops that we're seeing now.
Thanks, Art.
Yeah, those are great points, and especially like the cover cropping point. One of my favorite things is to dig up cover crops and check for nodulation, and I agree that sometimes I feel like it's taken as a given, and we don't talk a lot about inoculation. Most of the farms that I work with have had fairly good inoculation, but it's definitely not a given. And so I think delving into that cover crop world and having like an understanding of what that looks like in building long-term fertility, using that as a real strong tool to move forward with. I agree. Yeah.
But also, if you have legumes in the rotation, like beans and peas, for example,
Sure.
check on broad beans and so on, checking nodulation there. We saw years ago out looking at beans out in Delta. We looked at field after field, and we found almost no nodules. Why was that? Low pH in the soil, high available nitrogen, whatever it was. And so I think
Right.
all of our legumes really deserve some attention to the root systems, and are they nodulated? And what does a well-nodulated plant root system look like?
Totally. Yeah, that's a great point.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for everyone. Thanks to everyone for sticking around. And I hope we'll see quite a few of you at our session on Monday at the same time, from 10 to 11:30 with Drew to talk about integrated pest management. So I'll be sending out reminders about that and a link to the meeting as well. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone, and looking forward to hearing your feedback and any follow-up questions too. So take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Raylani and Amy. That was really great.